If we were to bring an ancient Roman back to life, how weird would not just modern Italian but all modern Romance languages sound to him as a Latin speaker? Hello noble ones and welcome to Metatron's Academy, the channel where we explore how to learn languages in the most fun and effective way possible, and today is the second episode of this speculative resurrection history that we are bringing forth in order to be able to understand a few of the linguistic evolutionary aspects and patterns when it comes to how languages evolve over time. Now, I've already made an episode about a medieval person, for example a medieval English knight, being catapulted to the modern era, hearing modern English. How weird would it sound? You'll find a link in the description. But today we're talking about an ancient Roman. So, when we say ancient Roman, of course, ancient Roman history is massive. We are talking about 1,000, 1,500 years, depending on when you start it. And therefore, we need to sort of kind of decide, are we talking about a speaker of Proto-Latin, Old Latin, Classical Latin, during the Principate, during the Dominate, late Roman Empire? What are we talking about? And the sort of Latin speaker that I'd like to focus on today is a classical Latin speaker. So we're talking about a specific time frame from the 2nd century BC to the 1st century AD. So within a space of 300 years, if you will. So a speaker of the times of Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus Augustus, the first Roman emperor. He's dead. It's, say, 30 AD. Then he's brought back to life now in 2023. Then you gather all the linguists we have, including Luc Ranieri, link in the description to Polemathy, and we organize a meeting and we try to talk to this person, of course using our own understanding of the reconstructed pronunciation of classical Latin. And let's see that yes, overall we did a pretty good job. Perhaps there are a couple of things that we're like, oh, that's fascinating. So he actually pronounced it this way, not that way. I mean, that surely could happen. But in general, let's say that the way we reconstructed classical Latin and the way it was pronounced in that specific time period is pretty accurate, or it is accurate enough to ensure mutual intelligibility. What's the next stage? Well, let's say that he's not kept secret and is not in some kind of basement on Area 51 or in the Vatican, and instead is walking around freely. How weird would it be for him to listen to a modern languages, considering the fact that French, Portuguese, Romanian, Italian, Spanish, they all derive from Latin. So could he still recognize some of the words? I think the best way to approach this subject, which is of course speculative in nature, is to try and project, like I did in the previous episode, the sort of changes that occurred to the way he is used pronouncing his own language Latin and the way it has become in Italian, in Spanish, in French. So let's establish a baseline of understanding. The way we understand classical Latin had rolled R's, so the R was trilled similarly to Spanish and Italian, and Portuguese and all the languages that use that kind of R. So already French would probably be the strangest sounding one to an ancient Roman, as they would be using a phenomenon that he would not be used to. And mind you, before any of you says, oh, maybe he would think that those are Gauls, like people from Gallia. No, he wouldn't, because even people who spoke not only Gallic languages, but even French up to, I want to say, just a few hundred years in the past, were rolling their R's. The French R is a relatively recent development which comes from an influence direct from High German. So at his time, no one pronounced the R. Another characteristic of classical Latin pronunciation will be the usages of suffixes at the end of words such as us and Now these are mostly gone in Romance languages. Look at the word museum, imperium, and then compare them to modern Italian museo, impero. Would he still recognize the word? In my opinion, it would. In fact, what's interesting is that English, with museum, at least conserves the original in Latin. With that being said, would he still be able to recognize the words? Well, let's look at a long modern word, and let's imagine it in 2,000 years in the future. And I think Spanish can help us out a little bit here. Think of the word hablar, to speak. Nosotros hablamos. The language has the os at the end. Now imagine that in 2,000 years, the os is dropped from the Spanish in the future. And they just say, nos hablamos. At the end of the day, you would still recognize it. It would just sound a little cut or a little short for you, but not too different. That is probably how a lot of modern vocabulary in Italian, sometimes in Spanish, in French would sound to an ancient Roman. It would just sound a little short. Imagine the English word epidermis, and then it becomes epider. Within a context, you might still recognize it. Another thought that I find particularly captivating and fascinating is the V. Now, we know that the ancient Romans in this specific time period would pronounce their V's like a W. Veni, vidi, vici, rather than veni, vidi, vici. How strange would it be to him that now the majority of Romance languages changed the pronunciation of the V into an actual V? Well, in my opinion, it would sound barbaric, in the sense that that's how some barbarians pronounced things, and it would sound a bit like a barbarian accent to him, rather than a native Latin accent. And interestingly enough, once again, even though the most conservative language is Sardinian, I'd like to underline, but in this specific case with the V, it's interesting because in English, when you say wall, the word is probably unrecognizable to an ancient Roman from the Latin word vallum. At least they preserve the W. So a Roman would have called it a vallum. A modern English person calls it a wall. So once again, to put us in the perspective of an ancient Roman, it would be like English in 2000 years, all the W's have become V's. Think of the word vol. This is my vol. I'd like some water, please. Sounds a bit German, doesn't it? It's probably what modern Italian, French, and Spanish tend to sound to a Roman. It sounds a bit Germanic when we pronounce the V. Now let's have a look at the C. The C for an ancient Roman was pronounced like a K, and we have a lot of proof for this. So it's not centurio, it's not centurion, it's centurio. It's centum, not centum. Well, interestingly enough, this sound is preserved in Sardinian. So in Sardinian, centu is the word for 100, and it's clearly conservative in nature. But how strange would it be for a Roman to hear the Italian word centurione to mean centurio? And in the same note, the G is always pronounced G in classical Latin, but in Italian it becomes a J, and then even an aspiration in Spanish. How weird would it be? Legione, legio. Let's apply the same method. Think of a word in English that is pronounced like a K. Turn it into a Ch. Kiss would become chiss. Let me chiss you. I want to give you a chiss. That's what it would sound to him. So to us, it might sound strange that they said centum and not centum, but to him, it sounds really weird that we say cento. The M at the end of words in classical Latin was pronounced almost as a half vowel. Basically, it's a nasalized sound. So you don't really say imperium, romanum. You say imperium, romanum, romanum for the phonemic vowel end. This is preserved very well in Portuguese. In Portuguese, they have a lot of... That's how they pronounce it. If you have an M, imagine an N as well. If you're Portuguese, let me know. At the end of a word, you tend to just nasalize it a lot. Well, that's what an ancient Roman would have sounded like. So what would be his reaction to us saying imperium? We would sound, once again, barbaric. How we have been specifically told by ancient Romans who said, if you don't want to sound like a barbarian, pretend that the M is not there. Just lightly touch upon it and move on to the next word. That's what people said from ancient Rome. So I'm pretty confident to say that if we say imperium, yeah, it would sound quite barbaric to him. Finally, let's talk about diphthongs. So I, A, and E together was fully pronounced and fully extended. Usually tends to have a stress at the beginning. So I, like in Caesar. That one becomes E in ecclesiastical Latin, Caesar. So how weird would it be for an ancient Roman to hear Caesar or Julius Caesar to be pronounced Caesar or Caesar? Well, Caesar, completely unrecognizable to him. Caesar wouldn't be. And this is the kicker. It wouldn't sound necessarily wrong. It would sound like you are from the countryside. The reason why I'm saying this is because even in the 1st century, so within the sphere of classical Latin speakers, there were already some people in the rural areas around Rome that were starting to use a more simplified pronunciation, specifically when it comes to the I diphthong. So the idea of Caesar, which was the correct way to speak in classical Latin, was already coexisting for some time with the simplified E of Caesar, which then evolves into Caesar. So in other words, if you had an ancient Roman from the countryside who wasn't particularly educated, he would have simplified it. But if you had a legionary who was from the city, or maybe someone with a certain level of education, they would have pronounced it Caesar. So that one to him, he would probably recognize it. It would be harder for the ch sound than it is for the diphthong itself. Okay, but I think, of course, there will be many other points that we could discuss. I can make an episode 2 if you're interested, but for now, let me know if you have comments. And as always, thank you for joining Metatron's Academy.